Yom Tov, everybody. Chaim. So, it was Shabbos morning. Everyone was gathered in shul. They were standing quietly, listening to the reading of the Torah. Suddenly, a loud crash. Everybody looked towards the front of the shul, and they saw a little doiver. 12-year-old boy had just collapsed, fallen down. They ran over to make sure he's okay. Doiver's father is out of town that week. Everybody came over to make sure he was okay. And the doctor ran over and said, "What happened? What happened to you?" And he said, "Didn't you hear what they're reading? They're reading the Toichacha. They're reading all the terrible things that are going to happen if the Jewish people sin, all of the terrible curses in this week's Torah portion." How could anyone listen to that and stand straight, right? Not fall down? So they said to him, first of all, the doctor actually, he became very, very ill from that. 3 weeks later, on Yom Kippur, they still weren't sure if he would be able to fast. He was almost 13. He was starting this fast then. And they had to actually bring a doctor to evaluate him to make sure he'd be able to fast properly. So they asked him, "Doiver, you hear the same Teichacha every year. So you never fainted before." So he said, "Usually my father's in town. My father's Alter Rebbe is in town and he reads the Torah. And when my father reads, I don't hear any curses." Right? That's how it is. So this week's Torah portion is full of, we have we have a list of 98 different things that are going to happen, 98 curses. And this is not the first time that we have a Teichacha. We had it way back in Parshas B'chukoisai. However, there's a very big difference. Over there, here it's double, that's true, but there's another difference. In Parshas B'chukoisai, big portion of the parsha is full of the Teichacha, full of all the curses. But then, towards the end, it ends off on a positive note, right? It says, despite all of this, even when they're in the land of their enemies, Hashem says, "I will not reject them, and eventually I'll bring them back." And Hashem ends off the parsha on a positive note. But in this week's parsha, we don't end off on a positive note, right? Next week we're going to kind of read a positive ending to the curses, in Parshas Nitzavim. But the Torah does not really end off the parsha, the Teichacha, on a positive note. And the question is why? Why did we do that earlier and over here we don't? Usually we always try to end on a positive note, right? Even if we have to dig into the negative, we always try to end off on a positive note. So, the Kloisenberger Rebbe unfortunately lost his whole family in the Holocaust, and he himself had to go through very difficult times. He was involved in the cleanup of the ghetto. Okay. In the cleanup of the ghetto, and the Nazis actually tried to liquidate them afterwards, and they had to hide. He had to hide in an open grave for an extended period of time. Wow. And during one of the times when the Nazi soldiers were searching for them, he was hiding in a balcony of an abandoned, bombed-out building. A few people were there, and they heard the dogs below searching for them. And suddenly he realized it was time to daven mincha. So he, forgets where he is, and he starts davening. And one of the other Jews who's there, waits till he finishes and says, "Rabbi, I don't understand. You don't see what's happening over here? We have the most powerful army in the world hunting us, searching for us, and you still believe that God is running the show? You still believe that God is controlling everything in the world? You're still praying to Him?" So the Rebbe says, listen to the words your own mouth is saying. The most powerful army in the world is fighting perhaps the most important war in history. They're trying to conquer all of Europe, eventually the entire world. Yet what do they devote their resources to? Are they sending their resources out to Russia, to the east, to win the war? No. They're taking a tremendous amount of their resources and they're saying, we're going to focus on this little tiny Jewish nation, and that's who we're going to try to destroy. Right? The most powerful army in the world comes along and says, we're going to place our main focus on this little tiny nation that we want to destroy. Is that normal? Does that make sense? How? I mean, look at us. We're hiding in this abandoned building and the most powerful army in the world is chasing after us. How can you say that Hashem is not running the show? How could you not see the hand of Hashem over here? Do you not realize that Hashem is sending them after us? Why He's doing it? That's a good question. But how could you say that Hashem is not running the show? Rabbi Yeshua Leib Diskin was rabbi in the city of Brisk. And unfortunately, there was a Jew in Brisk who decided he wanted to keep his store open on Shabbos. So the Jewish community organized a demonstration, a protest in front of his store. And unfortunately, I guess at that time in Brisk, one of the rights of the citizens was not peaceful protest. Peaceful protesting was not one of the rights that every citizen had. And this individual who owned the store was very well connected. And the next day, the police showed up at maybe even that day, maybe during the protest, they came and they started arresting people. And they arrested the president of the community, the Rosh HaKol. They threw him into a dark, dirty cell. And, he knew he was doing the right thing, but he's not too excited to be thrown into prison. And a few hours go by, and the police went and they found the rabbi of the community, Mr. Lev, and they arrested him as well, and they brought him to prison. And they bring him into the same cell as the Rosh HaKol, as the president of the community. So the Rosh HaKol gets up, he runs over to the rabbi, he gives him a big hug, and he says, Rabbi, I don't know how to feel about this. I have mixed feelings. On one hand, I'm so upset that they arrested the Rav, that they arrested the rabbi. But on the other hand, I'm happy. I don't have to be here alone. You're here with me, right? And I know if you're with me, I know I'm good. So I'm a little torn. I'm a little mixed up over here. I don't know how to feel about this. So Rabbi Yeshua Leib says to him, we have the same problem. We're in Galus now, and Hashem is with us in Galus. Wherever we go, Hashem is with us and following us and experiencing whatever we're experiencing. Now, we don't know how to feel about it. On one hand, right, we're broken. Hashem is going through such suffering. On the other hand, Hashem is with us. Right? Sure enough, it wasn't long before they were released. The Rabbi Yeshua Leib actually was told that he has to leave Brisk, and he left Brisk. He went to Yerushalayim, became a rabbi in Yerushalayim afterwards. But that was his attitude, right? Hashem is with us, and wherever in the darkest places, in the darkest prisons, Hashem is with us. There was a chassid who came to the Tasher Rebbe, and he says, he has a lot of tzaddis, a lot of problems, and he came to the Rebbe to pour out his heart and to list all of his problems. And the Rebbe, sees, he looks upset, he looks broken. He says, "Come, let's sit down. You'll tell me what you're going through." And the Rebbe calls over his gabbai, and he asks him to bring, some drinks for them. And the Rebbe asks him to bring him a hot tea. So they bring the Rebbe a hot tea. I don't know what they brought the chassid. And the Rebbe asked the chassid to move over, sit closer to him. And he sits down next to the Rebbe, and he starts, listing all of his tzaddis. I don't know what tzaddis he had. I'm not sure exactly what his problem. Rebbe, I don't know, last week my car broke down. I brought it into the mechanic. I don't know, they have to change the whole engine. Now I didn't have money to pay for the engine. I put it on my credit card. He's listing his problems. And the Rebbe hears his big tzara, and the Rebbe takes the cup, and the Rebbe actually, says, let me hold your hand while you're telling me your problems. So the Rebbe takes his hand, and the and the Rebbe picks up the cup of tea, and he splashes a little hot tea on his arm. Okay, he's a little bit surprised by this. He's never seen such behavior before, but he figures the Rebbe must have a reason for it. And the Rebbe says, "No, what else do you want to tell me about?" So he starts telling him about his second tzara that he has. He starts listing his problems, right? I don't know. A few days ago he had a fever and he one of his kids wasn't feeling very well, and he's listening. His second son and the Rebbe listens and he goes, "Oi!" and he takes a cup of tea and again he splashes a little hot tea on his arm, right? And then he goes on and he lists his third son, his fourth son, and every time the Rebbe goes, "Oi!" and he splashes a little tea on his arm. He finishes, after he finishes all of his problems, and he turns to the Rebbe. He's waiting for the Rebbe to, it's warm enough to drink. It wasn't that hot, And so the Rebbe so he's waiting for the Rebbe to give him an answer, to give him a bracha, to tell him something. So the Rebbe says to him, "Let me ask you a question, right? Did the hot tea hurt you?" He says, "A little bit, that wasn't too bad, but it did sting a little bit." "So why were you just sitting there quietly? Why didn't you say something? Why didn't you pull your arm away?" And he says, "Well, I don't know why the Rebbe is doing it, but I understood that if the Rebbe is listening to my tzadas and is splashing tea on me, there must be a reason. You must have some Kabbalistic reasons for what you're doing. Perhaps the hot tea is supposed to wash away my tzadas. I don't know the reason, but there must be a reason why you're splashing the tea on me. I mean, obviously you're sitting down, you're listening to my tzadas, and you chose to splash tea on me. I don't know why, but obviously you have a good reason. You're doing it for my benefit. I'm not going to complain." So he says, "Don't you realize that as much as I love you and as much as I want to help you, Hashem loves you 1,000 times more? Don't you realize that as many Kabbalistic secrets that you think I know, Hashem knows 1,000,000 times more? And when I splashed the tea on you, instead of getting upset, you said I must have a good reason. Don't you realize the same thing is true with Hashem? Everything that happens to you is being controlled by Hashem. How could you sit and complain about it? Right? And this is really the attitude that we have to take when we go through difficult times, right? We have to know that Hashem is with us, and Hashem loves us, and everything that happens is being controlled by Hashem. It's not happening on its own, right? And Hashem is a reason why it's happening. Right, and that's the greatest comfort. That's the greatest, the greatest joy that can happen to a person is when he realizes that Hashem is doing this. He has a reason for it. Right? We're still suffering.
Oh yeah.
But instead of jumping away at the hot tea, we say there must be a reason why he's splashing some hot tea. Right? That's the approach. And if we take that approach to the extreme and we realize how Hashem is our loving Father and how much He cares for us, so we can actually transform the suffering into good things. There was a story of the Baal Shem Tov, right? Today is the birthday of Alter Rebbe and Baal Shem Tov. We said the story of Alter Rebbe earlier. And we're going to say a story of the Baal Shem Tov. So it was Pesach. And hundreds of Hasidim came to Mezhebush to be with their Rebbe. And they noticed something was different. The Baal Shem Tov was usually, before Pesach, he was in a very good mood, very uplifted, very happy, big smile on his face. But this year, it was a little bit of sadness on the face of the Baal Shem Tov. And they realized there must be something over here. There must be something going on. The Baal Shem Tov must see some divine decree in heaven. And their suspicions were confirmed when the Baal Shem Tov called in a group of Hasidim on the night of Bdikas Chametz, and he says, "I want you to pray together, make a minyan to pray together, Tikkun Chatzos, the midnight prayer, and I want you to have deep Kabbalistic thoughts. He gives them a list of what they're supposed to think about, and the Baal Shem Tov themselves joined them, and in the middle suddenly collapsed on the floor. It looked like he fainted. They realized that something was going on. The next morning, the Baal Shem Tov asked the Hasidim to daven with the tune of Rosh Hashanah, and to treat it as if it were a Rosh Hashanah prayer. It was Erev Pesach, but he said to treat it as if it's a Rosh Hashanah prayer. And they realized that obviously something very serious is going on. After davening, the Baal Shem Tov gathered them together, and he began talking about the importance of bitachon, about trusting in Hashem. and trusting that everything is being controlled by Hashem. And if we are going through a difficult time and we don't know how to get out of it, we have to trust that Hashem loves us and He will help us out. And we have to do it with joy, said the Baal Shem Tov, not with worry. And right after that, the Chassidim saw a smile on the Baal Shem Tov's face, but they were able to see that it wasn't a real smile, as if you were celebrating that the decree was over. Instead, it was a think positive smile that he was trying to use to annul the decree. And again that night, he asked them, it was the night of Pesach, he asked them to daven in the tune of the Rosh Hashanah prayers. And then during the Seder, they all came to eat with the Baal Shem Tov, and the Baal Shem Tov also seemed much more serious than a regular year. And suddenly, in the middle of the Seder, towards the end of the Seder, the Baal Shem Tov stopped, and the room became quiet. The Baal Shem Tov remained quiet for a few minutes, and suddenly a big smile appeared on the Baal Shem Tov's face. His face lit up. He opened up his eyes, and he said, Mazel Tov! Blessed be Hashem, and blessed be His great name. He chose the most wonderful nation in the world. He chose the Jewish nation, where even a simple Jew can accomplish something that Yisrael Baal Shem Tov is not able to accomplish. And all the Hasidim were very curious to figure out what's going on over here. So they gathered around, and the Baal Shem Tov was ready to reveal the story. He said that in a nearby village, a small village near Mezhibush, the Gentiles, the Goyim of the town, who didn't like Jews very much, had been planning a pogrom. And they planned it perfectly for the first night of Pesach, to coincide with the end of the Seder. And the Baal Shem Tov said, I saw this, of course, yesterday, and I did everything I could to try to annul the decree, but it didn't seem to work. And that's why this morning I spoke to you about bitachon, and how you have to trust in Hashem, and how with joy you could break the decree. But I still saw there was we still had a lot of work left. And tonight, just now, something very interesting happened. There's a simple Jew who lives in this little village. He's not very learned, but he's a good Jew. He's a kind person. He likes helping people. And he was sitting. He's shy. Doesn't have any children. Him and his wife were sitting alone, celebrating the Seder. And he pulled out a Haggadah with the story of Pesach, and he began telling over the story of Pesach. And he reached this part of the story where Pari makes the decree that all Jewish children should be ripped away from their parents and thrown into the Nile River. And his wife began to cry. And he says, what are you crying? You know the story has a happy ending, right? I'm sure you know the end of the story, right? What are you crying for? So she says, if I would have a child, she says, I would never let anybody tear my child away from me. We're Hashem's children. How could Hashem do this? So he says, I'm sure you know that Hashem has a reason for everything He does. He begins trying to explain it to her, and how the suffering in Egypt was meant to atone for whatever needed to be atoned for. And she listens to everything he has to say, and she says, it doesn't matter. If I had a son, I don't care what he did, I'm not going to let somebody rip him away from me and do this to him. Right? How could Hashem do this? And, they're going back and forth, and in the meantime, they're eating the matzah, they're drinking the wine, and they're going through the Seder, and the discussion is going on. And the Baal Shem Tov says, well, they're having this discussion down here, their argument down here. There's also the same discussion going on up in heaven, right? There's a group of defending angels who's standing in front of Hashem and saying, Hashem, this is your only child, the Jewish nation. How could you do this to them? And then there are other angels who are saying, Hashem, there's a good reason. They have to go through a certain atonement. And there's going back and forth throughout the entire Seder until finally it comes time to drink the fourth cup of wine. And now, once he drinks the fourth cup of wine, the husband became quiet. And he turns to his wife and he says, you're right. You're right. Hashem is our Father. He shouldn't allow such a thing to happen. And they're both very happy. The argument is over. They reached a conclusion. And they're also both a little tipsy. And they stand up and they begin dancing together. And the Baal Shem Tov says at that moment in heaven, they also arrived at a conclusion. Right? They also arrived at the correct conclusion up in heaven. And when they started dancing, says the Baal Shem Tov, a tremendous joy spread throughout all the upper and lower worlds. And that's why my face lit up and a big smile appeared on my face. Right? So when we're going through the difficult times, we stop for a minute and we think, Hashem is our Father. So on one hand, we realize that He's with us, and that when the hot coffee spills at us, we don't have to jump. It's okay, there's a good reason. But if we truly believe it, and we have a real joy, and we rejoice in whatever happens, then we are able to transform that, and to turn whatever suffering into positive. Right? So that as Rav Doiver said, as the Mittler Rebbe said, when my father reads it, you don't hear any curses. Which means, when we know that Hashem is our Father, who's reading this, who's telling us all of this, then there aren't any curses. The Zohar Chadash in Parshas Savo tells us a story. Right? The beginning of the story, part of the story everybody knows. Right? We all know Rav Shimon Bar Yochai was being hunted by the Romans. He had to run away to a cave. Hashem made a carob tree and a well appear in front of the cave.
I know this.
And while Rab Shimon and his son are sitting there learning in the cave, says the Zohar, the other rabbis are sitting in the yeshiva. And they don't know where Rab Shimon Bar Yochai is. And they're sitting and they're learning. And they come to this week's Torah portion. Right? And they're sitting there and they're trying to figure out the question that we had in the beginning of the class. Right? We asked why in Parshas V'chukaisai do we have all of the curses, but we end off on a positive note with blessings. But in this week's Parsha, there's no positive ending. And the rabbis are struggling to try to figure it out, and nobody has an answer. So Rabbi Yehuda Bar Eloi gets up and he says, "Woe unto us, for we have lost the great Bar Yochai. No one can answer our questions now." Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda had a slightly different approach. He said, "Who said we lost Bar Yochai? He's son. We don't know where he is, but we could figure out a way to contact him." So he gets up the next morning, he looks out, and he sees a big flock of birds flying by, and he sees a little dove. And he calls out, he says, "Dove, faithful dove, who has been a faithful carrier of messages way back from the time of the Mabul. I have a message I need to send to Rab Shimon Bar Yochai." Okay, the dove flies down, he writes a little note with their question, and he sends the dove off. The dove flies to the cave, and brings the question to Rab Shimon Bar Yochai. Rab Shimon opens up the note, he sees the question, and he begins crying. And his son, Rabbi Lazar, says, "Why are you crying?" And he says, "I'm crying for two reasons. First of all, I miss my friends. Right? They're all learning without me. And second of all, I'm sad that the answer to this question wasn't revealed to them. It's a difficult question. I'm not able to sit and figure it out with them." And, it's a tough question. Why is there no positive ending? At that moment, says the Zohar, Eliyahu Hanavi appeared at the entrance of the cave. And he says to Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, "I was actually on a different mission. I'm on a very important mission now, but Hashem told me to come right away here because you're crying." Right? He sent me here to dry your tears and tell you that your friends weren't supposed to figure out the answer to this question, but I'm going to help you. I'm going to reveal it to you. Okay, sounds very exciting. So Eliyahu Navi says, he starts off, and he says that the earlier curses in Parshas V'chukaisai represent the Babylonian exile, the first exile, the first destruction of the first temple. And that was a short 70-year exile. It had a pretty quick positive ending. The second curses in Parshas Savo represent the destruction of the second temple and the long exile that we're in right now. And it doesn't appear like there's a positive ending, right? It seems like it's just going on and on and on. Right? And at that moment, before Eliyahu had a chance to finish the thought, the Zohar says a big wind came and it separated them, and Eliyahu flew up to heaven in a ball of flames. And Rav Shimon began crying again. This is right. Is this what he means? That in this galus there's no end? Chas v'shalom, right? And he was crying until he fell asleep at the entrance of the cave. And then suddenly Eliyahu returns, and he said, "Rise up, Rav Shimon, and wake up from your sleep, because Hashem wants to honor you, and He will reveal the answer to your question." The answer to your question is, in the earlier curses, we had to have blessings at the end, because we had to end off on a positive note. On these curses, there doesn't need to be blessings at the end. The blessings are hidden within the curses themselves. How is that? And this is a very difficult Zohar to understand. I'm going to try to say how I understood it. I heard this from Rabbi Yisachar Friend. He says in the earlier curse, if you take a look at the curses of Parshas B'chukaisai, there's a very different theme from what's going on over here. In Parshas B'chukaisai, Hashem repeats again and again. He says, let me see where it is. He says, if you halchu imi bekeri, afani elech imam bekeri. The Jewish people, they kind of ignored me. They didn't pay attention to me. So I'm going to ignore them too. I'm not going to deal with them. I'm going to let whatever happens to them. Right? Hashem's curses are, the curses in Parshas B'chukaisai are that Hashem says, I don't want to have anything to do with you. I'm going to distance myself from you. Whatever happens will happen. In this week's parsha, we have that's not the case. Hashem never says such a thing. Hashem says the exact opposite. Hashem is not going to ignore us. Hashem is not going to abandon us. Hashem says, I will come down and I will smite you and I will punish you and I will make you sick and I will do this and I will do that to you. Says Eliyahu Navi Hashem Bayachai, Hashem is our Father. When you see a father giving a good patch to his children, why is he doing it? Why is he doing it? He loves his child. Right? Now, as bad as we think it is when we see a father rebuking his child, it's 100 times worse when the father says, I don't want to have anything to do with my child. Chas v'shalom. Right? When a father is sitting there and he's rebuking his child, it means he cares for them. It means he loves them. Within the curses themselves, he says, you'll find the blessings. And then he goes on and he lists certain blessings, and the Zohar reveals how within the blessings themselves, within the curses themselves, there are blessings. But what the Zohar is saying something amazing. It's giving an amazing answer. Right? What Eliyahu and Navi and Rav Shimon Bar Yochai are telling us is that there is a fundamental difference between the Babylonian exile and the exile that we find ourselves in now. In the Babylonian exile, we don't find throughout most of the Babylonian exile that the Jewish people were persecuted by the nations around. There was an incident of Purim. There were, there were a few incidents. But throughout most of the time, they kind of got lost. Nobody cared about them. They were insignificant. In this long exile that we find ourselves in, the last thing a person can say is that the Jewish nation was lost in exile. We were the center of attention of the entire world throughout the last 2,000 years. Right? The greatest empires, the greatest armies, the greatest nations in the world all turned their focus to the little tiny Jewish nation to persecute us. And we find this again and again. We'll take in the 15th century where the Spanish Empire, right, the wealthiest and perhaps most powerful empire in Europe. What do they decide to do? Right? Instead of focusing on expanding their big expanding empire, we're going to focus on this little tiny nation. To send out all of our wealthy and talented businessmen and artisans and craftsmen. Who would ever think of such a thing? Which foolish nation who is so successful, so powerful, would decide to focus in on this little tiny group of people and send them out, and within 100 years, 200 years, they were gone. Whoever heard of the Spanish Empire was gone in 200 years. Right? As we mentioned earlier with the Kleisenberger era, right? The German army in World War II. The most powerful army in the world at the time. Right? They have an opportunity. They can conquer Europe. They can conquer eventually their goals were the entire world. What do they decide to do? Let's stop everything. And let's take a tremendous amount of our resources and devote it to destroying and wiping out this little tiny Jewish nation. Is that logical? It makes no sense. The whole world is focusing on us. Take a look today, right? You have the United Nations, right? They're supposed to be dealing with all the problems in the world. What does the United Nations spend all their time doing? They come in every morning, they sit down. You know that little country, Israel? I heard that when they were defending themselves, they bombed, they had to destroy a building. Well, let's write up a condemnation for the building that they knocked down. Right? That's really what's worrying them. The whole world is focused on us, right? This Sunday with everything that's going on in the world now, right? What's the New York Times front page? What did they decide to write a 4-page article about the Hasidic problems in the Hasidic schools? Right? Let's not focus on the 50-60% drug use in public schools. Let's focus on the 5-10% of drug use that we're able to dig up in the Hasidic schools and blame that on their system. I mean, does that make any sense? Hashem says, I'm here. The whole world is focused on you because I, the creator of the world, the one who's running in the world, am focused on you. I'm not ignoring you. I am putting all of my attention on you now. And this says, the Zohar says, Rav Shimon Bar Yochai is the greatest consolation. Right? When we look around and we see, like, we're attacked from all sides. Right? This is a Jewish nation as a whole, and also in our own personal lives. When we look around and it seems like everything is out to destroy us. We say, why is everything out to destroy us? Well, the whole world out to destroy us. What is Hashem telling me? Right? This is my father who's doing it. I heard an interesting story recently. I heard this from Official Schechter. He says that there was a Rav who was an expert in the laws of mikvahs, the laws of a mikvah. And he would travel around, and wherever he would go, he would examine, he'd travel to different cities, and he would examine the mikvah in each city that he would come to. And he would travel to many places, very small communities, a little mikvah. And he comes to this little city, and they bring him down to examine the mikvah. And, we're not going to have your class on the laws of mikvahs now, but the one important thing that we all need to know is that the water from the mikvah, right, the original water that comes into the mikvah, you get rainwater into the mikvah, but it cannot be she'uvim. She'uvim is water that was contained in a vessel, in some sort of container. Right? You can't take a bucket and fill it up and use it to fill the mikvah. The rainwater has to come to the mikveh. It can either fall directly into the mikveh, it can fall on the ground and roll into the mikveh, but it cannot go into any sort of vessel. And therefore, when they're building the mikveh, they have to be very careful. When they're building it in a building, they have to build a way for the water to get in, either from the roof or from the side, and they have to build a series of pipes to actually get the water into the mikveh. But they have to be very careful that when they make the pipe, it has to be completely straight, the pipe. If the pipe is curved, if it's a L or a U-shaped pipe, then that's a vessel, it can hold the water. If it's a completely straight pipe, it cannot hold the water. So they have to take a series of pipes and direct the water from one end to the other. So this Rav comes to this little city, and they bring him down to the mikveh, examines the mikveh, and he's looking around in the walls where the pipes are located, and he's looking around, and suddenly he can't believe his eyes. He sees one of the pipes is an actual keli, it's an actual vessel. And he runs over to the rabbi. He runs over to the rabbi and he says, one of the, your mikveh is a big problem. What's the problem? He says, the mikveh is not kosher. It never was kosher. And the rabbi is stunned. He's shocked. And this is a young rabbi. He says, I obviously didn't build a mikveh. My father built this mikveh over 30 years ago. And he says, are you telling me that the mikveh was never kosher? And he says, well, the way it looks now, it seems like the mikveh was never kosher. And the rabbi sits down, and his face turns pale, and he says, you know how many families lived here and built, you know how many children were born? You know how many families, marriages Jewish homes were built around this mikveh? You know how many converts became Jewish in this mikveh? You're telling me that it was never kosher? Is there a lenient opinion that we could rely on? And the Rav says, I'm sorry, it's very clear that this is not a kosher mikveh.
There's no argument?
And there's no argument about this. There might be an argument whether it's biblical or whether it's a biblical problem or a rabbinical problem, but it's clearly a problem. And I said, what do you do? What do I do? How do I deal with this? And he says, perhaps, maybe it wasn't the entire time. Maybe it was added later. Maybe there was construction done later on the mikveh. And if the original mikveh was a kosher mikveh, even if later, if the original water in the mikveh was kosher water, even if you later add a lot of mayim shuvim, it's not a problem, according to most opinions. So perhaps it was added later. And he says, does it look like it was added later? And the Rav says, not really, but let's look into it. And he says, I have to contact my father. My father recently retired. He was the rabbi of this community. He built the mikvah. So he calls his father, and he doesn't want to tell his father what happened. He doesn't want the father to hear about this. So he says, Dad, maybe you can tell me a little bit about the construction of the mikvah. How did it work? Were there a few different stages? Was the mikvah renovated afterwards? And his father says, no, it was all built at one time. But he says, can you tell me a little bit how, about the actual construction of the mikvah? You never spoke about it, he said. And he said, I don't know if I want to tell you. So much sadus I had when I was building that mikvah. And he said, what do you mean? And he says, okay, listen, I never really spoke about it. I don't even understand what happened when I built the mikveh, he said. But if you're asking, he says, I'll tell you. He says, when it came time to build a mikveh, there are always challenges when building a mikveh. First of all, there's financial challenges. You have to raise funds. In this particular community, there was a lot of opposition to the mikveh at the time, 30 years ago. There are people who thought that this wasn't a high priority in our community. And I had to invest a lot of time and effort to raise the funds and put up a pretty big fight to actually have the mikveh built. And after all the struggles, after we managed to build the entire mikveh, finally everything appeared to be done. We got ready to open up the big mikveh. We were going to make a big ceremony to open the mikveh. All we had to do is wait for the mikveh to fill up. And we wait a week, there's no rain. We wait 2 weeks, there's no rain. 3 weeks, 4 weeks. We're listening to the weather every day, and they start talking about this strange drought that's unheard of. They don't know when the next rain is going to be, and it's 100 miles away. It's raining normally, but in our area, there's no rain. And this goes on for another week, 2 months, no rain. This is unheard of. It hasn't been in the last 100 years. There hasn't been 2 months this season with no rain. And the people in the shul are complaining, what's going on with the new mikveh, it's the story, and we paid a lot of money, when is it opening? And we're trying to plan the ceremony, and we keep on pushing it off, and we're pushing it off. And another month goes by, 3 months go by, 4 months go by, and now people are really starting to complain. Every time I come to shul, people are like, what's going on with the mikveh? When's the mikveh going to open already? And I don't know what to do after 4 months, and so I called Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. And I asked him, what do we do? And he asked, is there a forecast? Is there an expectation for rain in the near future? And I said, not really. Nobody really knows. It's a strange drought, and nobody knows when it's, what's causing it and when it's going to end. So Moshe says, listen, if you really can't wait any longer, there is an option. In areas where there is no rain, there are certain areas where rain does not fall, desert areas. So another option is to fill the mikveh up with blocks of ice, right? Now this is not an easy thing to do. I mean, we try to get natural ice. We don't use artificial ice for such things. So you have to travel out to some mountaintop. You have to have a rabbi there inspecting it. They have to cut the ice into blocks. They have to make sure they transport it without keeping it in any sort of container. It has to be in like flat boards, I guess. And this was a whole thing. This was a big expense. We had to get a whole group to travel out somewhere, and it took a few weeks. It cost a lot of money. Finally, at the end, we were able to fill the mikvah up with ice, and we were able to finally open the mikvah. And you know what? 2 days later, after we opened the mikvah, suddenly some big thunderstorm hit the town. I said, I still today don't understand what's going on. So the once in 100-year drought has to hit us at the moment we're opening the mikvah. It seems like the people in the community were telling me that it seems like Hashem doesn't want us to open the mikveh. They were telling me, it was a crazy thing, and I never really spoke about it until today. And his son says, Father, you're right. Hashem was holding back the rain, but He was doing it because He loved us so much. If we would have had a rain, if it would have rained during those 5 months, the mikveh for the last 30 years, all the families, all the children that were born, all the marriages, all the converts that converted in that mikveh wouldn't have been kosher. But when everything is working against you and the craziest things happen, we have to realize Hashem has a reason for it. And ultimately, sometimes we see it, sometimes we don't. It's all for our good. And this is what Rav Shimon Bar Yochai is telling us. He's telling us that in Parshas L'Chukaisai, when it appears like Hashem is ignoring us, when Hashem says, Eilech imam bekeri, over there, you cannot end off on a negative. You have to end off on a positive note, because you cannot end off with Hashem ignoring us. But in this week's Parsha, where Hashem is not ignoring us, where the whole world is focusing on us to destroy us, where Hashem says, I am focusing all my attention on you to smite you and to punish you. When a Jew realizes this, that is the greatest blessing. We should all realize this in our own lives. And we have a day when it looks like the entire world is conspiring against us. So we have to realize that this is a message from Hashem, and Hashem is doing this as a loving Father to help us, and He's doing it for our best. L'chaim, l'chaim. And we should accept it with joy, as in the story of the Baal Shem Tov, and transform it into open and visible good. L'chaim, l'chaim.